Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Пользуясь случаем, хочу поблагодарить наших кубинских друзей за теплый прием.
I thank our Cuban colleagues for their warm welcome and for their mutual cooperation. The anti-corruption policy of the Russian Federation has gained a systematic nature. The main task of all the state and municipal bodies is prevention of corruption, the struggle against its different expressions and manifestations, and the control of the consequences of the crimes of corruption. The main objectives of the national plan of the struggle against corruption for 2016-2017, approved by the President of the Russian Federation, determine the following: to increase the role of the bodies and of the regional authorities to prevent corruption and other crimes, as well as the creation of commissions for the struggle against corruption. In the national program of struggle against corruption for the 2018 up to 2020, we have emphasized on the state and municipal needs for this struggle. In the last 2 years, the work has been geared to the prevention of corruption and other crimes, which is implemented according to the anti-corruption law. We have the appropriate implementation, application of this law. The state central body of Russia that ensures the implementation of state policy of the struggle against corruption is led from the office of the President of the Russian Federation, especially the struggle against corruption in activities with the councils created by the President for the struggle against corruption. The fight against corruption and crime is undertaken by the Attorney General's office, which is member of the Presidential Council for the fight against corruption of the Russian Federation. There is close cooperation with the state bodies for the legal training of citizens. There are permanent working groups, and there is an exchange of experiences. Assessment and verification and inspections is done on a regular basis, especially when we get specific signs of violations of the law. 246,000 violations of the law were identified. 58,000 presentations or claims were filed and heard by courts. According to the results and the decisions, 65,000 officials were sanctioned. Others were sanctioned administratively, and around 3,500 cases were heard. Prosecutors identify and tackle the most significant corruption cases. The number of people who have been fired for lack of confidence has quadrupled. Last year, over 4,000 officials lost their position and power. These measures are flagrant corruption crimes, concealing information on income, and new measures have been put in place for the solution of conflicts of interest. All these issues emerged after changes were made to the existing legislation early this year, and the number and the names of people who were fired for corruption-related crimes was published. However, we still face many challenges. when overseeing the work of prosecutors, we must pay attention to the responsibilities provided and given to prosecutors under the law for the prevention of corruption and other crimes. In this regard, I would like to refer to problems that are more pressing. The work of any unit for the prevention of corruption begins with the creation of a legal and institutional framework that should be vast enough and meet the requirements of the federal law. Prosecutors study legal action, especially those who govern the activities of committees for the fulfillment of the requirements of behaviors in public service and the solution of conflicts of interest, as well as the procedures to present information on incomes and expenses. In most state bodies, these standards have been approved, but they are not always timely aligned with the struggle against corruption. There's a list of positions of people appointed, and they need to present the statement of income and expenses. And these should be published on the internet, as well as the procedures for and the set of rules of the commissions that oversee the work of public officials. 1/3 of the cases are due to non-performance or failure to comply with their duties. Others have to do with the incomplete presentation of information on their income, property by municipal state officials. For example, in 2017, after the Attorney General's Office of the Russian Federation analyzed the presentation of an agent of a communications federal agency, he was fired because he lost the confidence of the director of the state-owned company of communications because he had concealed information on property he had in the United States, as well as information on financial obligations under a loan agreement and account. At the same time, the prosecution authorities oversee the ongoing controls and the replacement or substitution of the human resource departments. The strategy of the prosecutors is the solution or tackling the most serious cases related with a deliberate and intentional concealment of considerable income. In the last few years, the prosecutors exercised their function to control the expenses of officials and the return of the goods or assets for which they have not presented due evidence. These measures were put in place since 2013 and were later incorporated into Russia's laws in order to implement the UN Convention Against Corruption, specifically the provisions against unlawful enrichment. The different human resource departments of the government bodies must receive training in the effective legislation. There was a significant reduction in 2017 in the number of violations from 4,600 to 2,800. In order to eradicate them, over 700 presentations have been made. Over 1,000 claims have been filed. At the request of prosecutors, 500 officials were given disciplinary measures. The number of control procedures by prosecutors to determine the compatibility of income and expenses by public officials led to several cases to be heard, and billions of rubles were recovered. There were 26 claims for a value of $1.5 million. There were 15 claims for a value of 1.9 billion rubles. From 34.1 million ruble to 134.5 million rubles, the value added of the property returned to the government has quadrupled, and information was not presented. Therefore, we're talking about property, land plots, and commercial establishments that could not be legally justified by the officials. Most of the perpetrators or corrupt officials were municipal and local officials who were dishonest. The main way for concealing income incurred expenses was presenting non-reliable and incomplete information to the Human Resource Department. Prosecutors identify cases of deliberate alienation of properties in litigation in favor of relatives of public officials, and they also evaded or failed to comply with their obligation to present complete information. All these tricks and strategies are pointless. We have close and effective cooperation with the Federal Service of Financial Monitoring. We have signed the relevant agreements for the proper, effective, and timely solution of any case. The upper judicial bodies was created in order to recover the equivalent value of the property so that it can be restored to the government. We also have the solution of conflicts of interest, which is a serious issue. According to the requirements of the Russian legislation, a public official is solved to take measures in order to prevent any possibility of occurrence of conflicts of interest in their performance of their duties. In the last year, there was a 3% increase from 2,400 in 2004 in 2016 to a bigger number in 2017. The number of cases of conflict of interest that were not solved increased. Often there are violations like the participation in meetings of the opposition committees for a marked personal interest. At the same time, in order to avoid mistakes, the identification of a conflict of interest requires a thorough study of all the aspects of the activities and the duties that the individuals or the officials undertake. I will now talk about the observance by public officials of the obligation of having deposit accounts and financial deposits abroad. I would like to assure you that the Attorney General's Office of the Russian Federation is working closely with law enforcement bodies and with foreign colleagues to ensure mechanisms to verify the existence of these accounts. We closely collaborate with our foreign colleagues in cases of seizure, embargo, forfeiture, and recovery of assets attained from the commission of crimes and as a consequence of corruption-related crimes. We also take into consideration the denounces by regular and everyday citizens. We are confident that the implementation of this initiative will allow us that this year all the law enforcement and government units involved in corruption and other types of crimes prevention are involved. I would like to highlight that the cooperation of the Attorney General's Office of the Russian Federation with other foreign partners takes place under the framework of the National Plan of Struggle Against Corruption. In October 2016, an agreement was signed that has already been signed by the Russian Federation, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and other countries who have implemented the required internal procedures to implement this plan. Other countries have the condition or categories of observers. During the meeting, a series of key decisions were adopted, which are crucial for the future work of the Council and will ensure the improvement of the work of the members of the Russian Federation in the struggle against corruption. Up to the present, the Attorney General's Office has signed 82 bilateral agreements and 5 multilateral agreements and interinstitutional and cooperation agreements with partners from 62 countries. Over 80 countries cooperate in the area of criminal proceedings in cases for extradition, legal assistance, and the recovery of assets abroad that have been illegally acquired. In order to continue developing the measures implemented in our country, in order to prevent corruption, we could use the experiences implemented in other countries and by international organizations that fight corruption. Russia was evaluated by the group that fights corruption, GRECO, which is an international organization created over 15 years ago by the member studies of the Doha Council in order to help in the implementation of unified standards against corruption. Although the evaluation round has to do with certain categories of public officials, parliamentarians, judges, and prosecutors, the statement of income and expenses and other provisions against corruption was investigated by the committee that fights corruption in our country. According to our general practices, we received a positive evaluation because we follow international standards. I would like to highlight that the struggle against corruption should not be only limited to the implementation of legal measures for the legal prosecution of corruption-related crimes. It is important to raise awareness in citizens. We must develop a psychology and culture of non-acceptance and zero tolerance of corruption manifestations. In the near future, we will have to implement educational measures and provide advice to public officials, including confidential advice. I'm convinced that today's discussion on all these pressing issues will be fruitful and will serve as an important tool in the establishment of an implementation practice of the law that meets the current needs of our societies. To conclude my presentation, I once more wish to thank the Attorney General of the Republic of Cuba for their warm welcome. Thank you very much.